March 8, 1945. Pilots from the 497th Bomb Group stared at their B-29 Superfortresses in disbelief. Maintenance crews were ripping out the 50-caliber machine guns, the turret mechanisms, the ammunition boxes, every defensive weapon except the tail guns. The sound of steel scraping across tarmac echoed through the night as 6,000 pounds of firepower was dragged away from each aircraft. They were being sent over the most heavily defended city on Earth, defenseless. And they weren't flying at the doctrine-mandated 30,000 feet where enemy guns couldn't reach them. They were going in at 5,000, low enough to see individual buildings, low enough to be hit by small arms fire. Their commander, Major General Curtis LeMay, had abandoned every rule in the manual. The Air Force brass called him insane. The crews thought it was a suicide mission. If he was wrong, he wouldn't just be court-martialed. He would be the man who signed the death warrants of 3,000 airmen in a single night. This wasn't just a tactical shift. It was a $3 billion gamble with the most expensive weapon in human history. And the clock was ticking. But in one single night, this decision would change the course of the war and save 1 million lives. The question was how a general could justify sending defenseless bombers into the heart of Japanese air defenses. The answer began 2 days earlier in an operations room on Guam. March 6, 1945. Major General Curtis LeMay stood in the operations room at Guam staring at reconnaissance photographs of Tokyo spread across the briefing table. The Pacific humidity hung heavy in the room despite the fans. Cigar smoke curled from the ashtray beside the photos. His staff officers waited in uncomfortable silence. LeMay was thinking, calculating. The weight of 500,000 American lives rested on decisions he would make in this room. They knew what was coming. For 3 months, 21st Bomber Command had been sending B-29 Superfortresses against Japanese targets from 30,000 feet using precision daylight bombing. The factories kept humming. The gears kept turning. The Nakajima aircraft engine plant they'd bombed 4 times was still operating at 90% capacity. The Mitsubishi Heavy Industries complex showed minimal damage after 6 raids. 3 months of bombing, 1,600 sorties, 3,600 tons of high explosive dropped. Result, 1.4% reduction in Japanese war production capacity. Meanwhile, American forces were preparing to invade Okinawa in April. Then the Japanese home islands. Intelligence estimates predicted 500,000 to 1 million American casualties in the invasion. 1 million Americans would die fighting their way through Japan unless something changed. LeMay understood what his staff didn't want to acknowledge. American doctrine was failing, and Americans would pay the price in blood. LeMay had been sent to the Marianas to fix this problem. He was the most aggressive and effective air commander in the European theater. He had redesigned bomber tactics that reduced losses by 30% while increasing accuracy. But he had learned something his superiors refused to accept. Doctrine was theory. Results were reality measured in lives. And in March 1945, doctrine was producing catastrophic results. LeMay had studied what the Japanese had done to American prisoners. The Bataan Death March, where Japanese forces killed approximately 10,000 prisoners of war, including hundreds of Americans and thousands of Filipinos. The Manila Massacre, where Japanese troops killed 100,000 Filipino civilians and tortured captured Americans. Reports from liberated POW camps described systematic starvation and brutal treatment of American prisoners. These weren't soldiers following rules of war. These were an enemy that had to be destroyed completely, or they would kill every American who landed on their beaches. The strategic bombing campaign was supposed to make invasion unnecessary. 3 months of high-altitude precision bombing had accomplished almost nothing. Young Americans were going to die by the hundreds of thousands unless LeMay found a way to end this war from the air. March 7, 1945. LeMay called a meeting with his senior staff officers at 21st Bomber Command headquarters. What he proposed in that room would save hundreds of thousands of American lives. We're going to strip the guns from the B-29s. All defensive armament except the tail guns. Silence. His operations officer thought he had misheard. "Sir, strip the guns?" LeMay continued without acknowledging the reaction. "We're going to fly at 5,000 to 7,000 feet instead of 30,000 feet. We're going to bomb at night instead of daylight. And we're going to use incendiary bombs instead of high explosive. The goal is to destroy Japanese war production wherever it exists, and it exists in every neighborhood in Tokyo." His intelligence officer found his voice. "Sir, flying at low altitude will expose the aircraft to every anti-aircraft gun in Tokyo. We'll lose half the force." LeMay had anticipated this objection. He had spent 2 weeks analyzing Japanese air defense capabilities. The data told a different story than conventional wisdom suggested. Japanese fighter forces were depleted. American raids had destroyed 60% of defending aircraft. Their heavy flak guns were designed for bombers at 20,000 to 30,000 feet, not 5,000 feet. And night operations would severely degrade Japanese defensive effectiveness. Most fighters and anti-aircraft batteries relied on visual targeting. LeMay explained this analysis to his staff. The response was skepticism. These were experienced officers who understood air combat doctrine. Everything LeMay was proposing violated fundamental principles. Remove defensive guns, and you remove the ability to defend against fighter attacks. Fly at low altitude, and you make the aircraft vulnerable to every weapon the enemy possesses. His operations officer raised the inevitable question. "Sir, this means targeting residential areas. Washington is going to have serious problems with calling this precision bombing of military targets." LeMay's response revealed why he had been sent to command 21st Bomber Command. Tokyo is a military target. Intelligence reports confirm that Japanese war production is dispersed across thousands of small workshops in residential neighborhoods. Japanese families are manufacturing aircraft components, artillery shells, and rifle parts in their homes. The entire civilian population is engaged in war production. There is no such thing as a non-military target in Tokyo. This wasn't an exaggeration. Japanese industrial mobilization in 1945 had moved approximately 40% of war production into dispersed cottage industries. Families worked in their homes, manufacturing precision parts for aircraft engines and weapons. You can't precision bomb a workshop that's in someone's living room. They're 20 feet wide, scattered across 100 square miles of city. The only way to destroy Japanese war production is to burn down the neighborhoods where that production is happening. LeMay understood what he was proposing. Families would die. Children would burn. There was no way to separate military targets from civilian populations when the military targets were inside civilian homes. He had calculated the cost on both sides. 100,000 Japanese civilians dead in firestorms, or 500,000 Americans dead on invasion beaches. LeMay laid out the strategic reality his staff didn't want to acknowledge. The regime that had shown no mercy at Bataan would fight to the death and take every American they could with them. The choice was clear. Burn down Japanese war production now and end the war from the air, or send soldiers to invade those islands and watch them die by the hundreds of thousands. LeMay's staff understood the calculation. This wasn't about following doctrine. This was about choosing which population would pay the price in blood. LeMay had concluded that following the manual was producing casualties. He would abandon the high-altitude playbook to bring the troops home alive, and if Air Force brass called him insane for it, he'd prove them wrong with results. The decision to strip the guns wasn't arbitrary. LeMay had done the mathematics. A fully armed B-29 carried over 6,000 pounds of defensive guns, ammunition, turret mechanisms, and fire control systems. Remove that weight, and the B-29 could carry an additional 6,000 pounds of incendiary bombs. For a force of 300 B-29s, that meant an additional 1,800,000 pounds of ordnance per mission. That extra payload would determine whether the attack succeeded or failed. LeMay authorized the modifications immediately. Maintenance crews at Northfield on Guam began stripping guns from B-29s on March 8th. The sound of heavy turret mechanisms being dragged across the tarmac echoed through the night. Ground crews removed the turrets, dismantled fire control systems, pulled ammunition boxes, and sealed the openings with metal plates. They weren't just removing steel. They were removing the crew's sense of safety. For a 19-year-old gunner, those .50 caliber guns were his only hope of survival against Japanese fighters. The modifications horrified the bomber crews. When pilots and gunners saw their aircraft being stripped of defensive weapons, they understood what LeMay was proposing. They would be flying into Japanese airspace with almost no ability to defend themselves against fighter attacks. If Japanese night fighters found them, they would die. B-29 gunners with the 497th Bomb Group later described the crew reaction. "We thought LeMay had lost his mind. Taking the guns off made us sitting ducks." LeMay wanted to fly the lead aircraft himself. His staff argued fiercely against it. Theater commanders didn't fly combat missions. He was too valuable to risk capture. But LeMay made sure every crew member knew he had wanted to fly with them. That knowledge affected their confidence more than any briefing could. March 9th, 1945, 2 p.m. 334 B-29 crews filed into briefing rooms across the Marianas. Guam, Tinian, Saipan. Every bomber base received the same briefing simultaneously. When the curtain covering the target map was pulled back, crews saw a route they'd never flown before. The briefing officer's voice carried across the room. "Tonight's target is Tokyo. Primary aiming point is the Shitamachi district. You will fly at altitudes between 5,000 and 7,000 feet. Bomb load is M69 incendiary clusters. Defensive armament has been removed from all aircraft except tail guns." The room erupted. Crews shouted questions simultaneously. 5,000 feet? Without guns? At night? The briefing officer waited for silence. General LeMay wanted to personally lead the mission in the command aircraft. That announcement changed the atmosphere instantly. If LeMay was willing to fly lead, the plan wasn't insane. It might be dangerous, but it was calculated risk, not suicide. The briefing continued with specifics. Time over target would be staggered from 12:15 a.m. to 3 a.m. Lead aircraft would mark the target area with incendiary bombs. Follow-on waves would bomb the marked area, creating a firestorm. Minimum altitude for bombing run was 4,900 feet. Maximum was 9,200 feet. Most aircraft would hit between 5,000 and 7,000. Crews learned they would carry the maximum possible load of M69 incendiary clusters. Each aircraft would drop approximately 6 tons of incendiaries. 334 aircraft would drop over 650,000 incendiary bomblets on Tokyo in one night. The intent was to create a firestorm so intense it would generate its own weather patterns. Crews understood what this meant. They weren't bombing factories. They were bombing neighborhoods where people lived and worked. Women, children, elderly. The fires wouldn't distinguish between the aircraft worker and his family sleeping in the next room. Some crew members requested to be removed from the mission roster. LeMay had anticipated this. He addressed the requests personally. Any crew member who didn't want to fly the mission could stand down without prejudice. A handful of men requested removal. LeMay granted every request. The remaining crews would fly. That evening, maintenance crews loaded incendiary bombs into 334 B-29s. Each aircraft was fueled to maximum capacity. Each aircraft was stripped of every piece of equipment not essential to the mission. Some aircraft flew without their auxiliary power units to save weight. At 5:36 p.m., the first B-29 took off from Guam. Curtis LeMay was not in the lead aircraft. Brigadier General Thomas Power led the Pathfinder aircraft instead. LeMay monitored the mission from the operations center, tracking each bomber as it took off and formed up. His crews knew he had wanted to fly with them. They knew he'd been prohibited only because he was too valuable to risk losing. That was enough. LeMay had proven his confidence in the plan by his willingness to risk his own life on it. Over the next 2 hours, 334 B-29 Superfortresses took off from bases across the Marianas and formed up for the flight to Tokyo. They flew north through darkness toward the most destructive bombing raid in human history. March 10th, 1945, 12:08 a.m. Tokyo time. The first B-29 crossed the Japanese coast at Chiba, 60 miles southeast of Tokyo. The aircraft belonged to the 497th Bomb Group, flying as lead pathfinder. Its mission was to mark the target area for the follow-on waves. The Pathfinder B-29 carried a load of M47 incendiary bombs mixed with high explosive bombs. The incendiaries would create visible fires to mark the aiming point. The high explosives would destroy firefighting equipment and disrupt Japanese emergency response. The pilot held altitude at 5,200 feet. The aircraft was stripped of all defensive guns except the tail position. The gunner sat alone watching Japanese searchlights sweep the sky below. Tokyo spread beneath them like a sea of darkness broken by scattered lights. Blackout conditions were in effect, but the city was too large to completely darken. The Pathfinder's bombardier activated his Norden bomb sight. The target was the intersection of two major streets in the Shitamachi district. Inside the cockpit, the only sound was the drone of engines and heavy breathing and oxygen masks. The crew was flying low enough to see individual buildings, low enough to be hit by small arms fire. Defenseless, except for one tail gun. At 12:15 a.m., the first bombs fell on Tokyo. M47 incendiaries hit residential blocks and exploded in clusters of white fire. High explosive bombs detonated seconds later, throwing debris and destroying water mains. Within minutes, the target area was marked by a growing pattern of fires. The second Pathfinder arrived at 12:17 and dropped its load 300 yards north of the first. The third arrived at 12:20 and marked the southern edge of the target zone. By 12:30 a.m., the Pathfinders had created a crosshair pattern of fires approximately 1 mile across. Japanese air raid sirens wailed across Tokyo. Civilians who had experienced previous high-altitude raids moved to air raid shelters. But this raid was different. The bombers were low enough that people on the ground could hear the engines clearly. The sound was terrifying. 18 Wright R-3350 engines per aircraft producing a distinctive deep roar. 334 aircraft meant over 6,000 engines approaching Tokyo. The sound built into a continuous thunder that lasted for hours. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries opened fire on the Pathfinders. Heavy flak burst at altitudes between 15,000 and 25,000 feet, well above the B-29s. Light anti-aircraft fire was more accurate, but less intense than American crews had expected. The Pathfinders completed their runs and turned east toward Guam. Behind them, the main force was arriving. At 12:45 a.m., the first wave of 100 B-29s reached Tokyo and began their bombing runs. The M69 incendiary clusters began falling across the Shitamachi district at 12:50 a.m. Each cluster broke open at 2,000 feet altitude, releasing 38 individual bomblets. The bomblets tumbled through darkness, trailing white phosphorus smoke. On impact, they ignited. Jellied gasoline burned at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel. Within minutes, thousands of fires were burning across several square miles. As more B-29s arrived and dropped their loads, the fires combined into a massive conflagration, a moving wall of fire driven by hurricane-force winds. At 1:30 a.m., surface winds around the fire zone exceeded 60 miles per hour. The firestorm was creating its own weather system, drawing in oxygen that fed the fires. B-29s continued arriving every few minutes. Crews at altitude could see the fires clearly from 40 miles away. The target area glowed orange and red, visible through the darkness. Pilots reported thermal updrafts so powerful they lifted B-29s hundreds of feet despite full-down elevator. The heat was a living thing. Crews at 7,000 feet could smell it through their oxygen masks. Burnt oil, scorched wood, the metallic tang of jellied gasoline. The conflagration was breathing, inhaling oxygen from miles around, and exhaling superheated air that tossed 65-ton bombers like paper. Some bombardiers reported difficulty seeing their aiming points through smoke. They dropped their loads based on position relative to visible landmarks around the fire zone. By 2 a.m., the conflagration covered approximately 15 square miles. The temperature at ground level exceeded 2,000 degrees. Everything in that district burned. Wood, steel, concrete. The human cost was staggering. 100,000 people perished in a single night. The conflagration consumed the city's oxygen, rendering shelters useless, and turning streets into impassable corridors of fire. Entire families were lost in those 6 hours. The disaster destroyed not just Tokyo's industrial capacity, but thousands of homes where families lived and worked. LeMay had calculated this cost. He had decided it was necessary to prevent something worse. At 2:30 a.m., the last wave of B-29s approached Tokyo. These crews had been flying for 7 hours. They expected to find anti-aircraft fire and searchlights. Instead, they found a burning wasteland visible from 100 miles away. Pilots from the 500th Bomb Group later described the site. We could see Tokyo burning before we reached the Japanese coast. The entire city looked like it was on fire. When we got closer, we could see that half the city actually was on fire. Smith's bombardier reported that smoke from the fires reached their altitude of 6,500 feet. They dropped their incendiaries through smoke so thick they couldn't see the ground. By 3 a.m., 334 B-29s had dropped 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo. The last aircraft turned east and headed back to the Marianas. Behind them, the firestorm continued burning. Japanese emergency services had lost control. Fire brigades stopped fighting the fires and focused on evacuation. But streets were blocked by fire, debris, and panicked crowds. The fires burned throughout the night. By 8 a.m. on March 10th, the firestorm began to diminish as it ran out of fuel. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to ash. Japanese authorities began counting casualties. The official death toll was set at 100,000, though the true count was likely much higher. Another 40,000 survivors were left with severe injuries. Over 1 million people were suddenly homeless. The Shitamachi district had been erased. Entire neighborhoods that had existed for centuries were gone. The scale of displacement and loss would reshape Tokyo for years to come. LeMay's raid on Tokyo was the test case. Reconnaissance photographs would tell him whether the gamble worked. 14 B-29s were lost. The human cost on the ground was almost incomprehensible. March 11th, 1945. The Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington received LeMay's after-action report. The report detailed the tactical execution of the mission, bomb damage assessment, and strategic implications. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, read the report and immediately understood what LeMay had accomplished. Months of high-altitude bombing had barely scratched Japanese production. One night of incendiary bombing had destroyed more than the entire previous campaign. That was a 13-fold increase in effectiveness. Arnold faced a decision. The pressure was enormous. The B-29 program had cost over $3 billion. If the strategic bombing campaign continued failing, Arnold would have to explain how the most expensive weapons program in history had accomplished almost nothing. He could reprimand LeMay for abandoning doctrine, or he could endorse tactics that actually worked. The numbers made the decision obvious. One night of incendiary bombing had destroyed more than 3 months of precision bombing. Losses were lower than high-altitude missions. Arnold made his decision on March 12th. He sent a message to LeMay authorizing continuation of low-altitude incendiary attacks against Japanese cities. The message was clear. Washington valued results over doctrine. LeMay's tactics worked. Some officers questioned whether the civilian casualties could be justified. Arnold's response shut down that discussion. This was total war against an enemy that had shown no mercy. But the question remained. Had LeMay found the least terrible option among terrible choices? Or had the war changed them into something they wouldn't recognize? The choice was clear. Destroy Japanese war production now through air power, or send troops to invade and die by the hundreds of thousands. LeMay received Arnold's authorization and immediately planned follow-up raids. Over the next 2 weeks, B-29s hit Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe with incendiaries. By the end of March 1945, approximately 30 square miles of Japanese urban industrial areas had been destroyed. LeMay had proven that aggressive tactics executed properly produced results with lower casualties. The Air Force brass who had resisted his plan were now ordering its expansion. Between March and August 1945, LeMay's bombers hit 67 Japanese cities. The campaign destroyed 180 square miles of urban industrial capacity. By summer, Japan's war production had collapsed by 60%. The atomic bombs dropped in August were delivered by B-29s under LeMay's command. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered unconditionally. The invasion never happened. Not one American soldier had to storm Japanese beaches. Operation Downfall's estimated 500,000 to 1 million American casualties became a statistic that existed only on paper. LeMay had been sent to end the war from the air. He accomplished that mission. But the cost was measured in 67 cities, reduced to ash, and hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians dead. He never apologized for the decision. In his memoir and interviews, he defended it as necessary. He understood the moral weight of choosing between terrible options. Years later, LeMay said something that revealed his understanding of the moral stakes. He believed that if he had lost the war, he would have been tried as a war criminal. He knew exactly what he had done. In 1948, he commanded the Berlin airlift. In 1961, he became Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. His career proved that military leadership recognized his strategic genius despite the moral complexity of what he'd done. Curtis LeMay died in 1990 at age 83. History continues to debate whether firebombing Japanese cities was justified, but it cannot deny the outcome. The invasion never happened, and he brought the boys home.